Actually, let's do that. Okay, good.
Perhaps before we should just mention that we will be recording. If anybody has a problem with it, please let us know. And it will only be for purposes of being part of the webpage in the Biennale during the duration of the Biennale. Thank you. So please go ahead to and
absolutely.
And
all right.
Che, you should introduce yourself. You are our moderator today. It's a pleasure. So I give the word to you, and we can come back.
Okay, so yeah, it's I don't think it's no longer a secret because we're doing this within the platform of the Venice Biennale of Architecture. But I am actually Anna's hidden brother. I'll just put it that way. I'll just start off like that. But no. In all seriousness, Anna and I, we worked together a couple of years ago at UMA when I was a visiting researcher over there. I am currently, my name is An Jae-woo, by the way, and it's a Korean name because obviously I'm Korean. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it's a Korean name. An is my family name and Jae-woo is my given name. And that's, because there's a space in between, that does not mean that it's like first name and middle name. That's just one name with a space in between. So please call me Jae-woo. I would appreciate that. And I am a culture critic, an architecture critic, and a student of urban sociology. And I'm also an independent curator. I had the absolute pleasure of doing a few projects with Anna 2 years ago at Umeå. And I am also currently a member of the Korean Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture as well. And of course, over there, I am also collaborating with Anna. It is an absolute pleasure to be given the opportunity to moderate this rather significant roundtable on an extremely important topic. So let me just go straight into the introduction of what exactly we're trying to do today. So this is a roundtable discussion with Ana Betancour, Sonja Oliveira, Jonathan Mosley, and Torsten Schröder. I hope I have pronounced your names correctly. If not, please forgive me. But these four brilliant minds will present to you a set of propositions and provocations of how we see, live together, and imagine alternative futures for a radical architecture for sustainability. Drawing on multidisciplinary insights, the roundtable will stretch the possibilities of how we represent, create, and dream an architecture that embodies and inhabits complexity and entanglement in all its guises. And to provide you with just a little bit more detail on who the four distinguished speakers are, first off, Ana Betancour is an architect and a professor of architecture. She's a former rector at UMA, the Umeå School of Architecture at Umeå University, a professor in urban design at Chalmers, and the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, plus other schools internationally. She founded Architecture Plus Urban Research Laboratory, the U+AD Lab, the Urban Architecture Agency, PHAB Architects, and is a member of many international juries and committees, and is a key collaborator with Radical Architecture Practice for Sustainability, or as we all know, RAPS, as well. Then as for Dr. Sonja Oliveira, Dr. Sonja Oliveira has over 20 years of design innovation and research experience in the sustainability and design sector as a climate action thought leader. She founded RAPS Research Initiative and is currently Thought Leadership Specialist Advisor to the Design Council and a board member of the World Green Building Council in Serbia. She is Professor of Architecture and Sustainability Design Innovation at the University of Strathclyde. As for Jonathan Mosley is a conceptual artist/architect with Warren and Mosley, Associate Professor of Architecture and Experimental Practice at Bristol UWE, and a co-founder of the RAPS Network. Collaborating with artist Sophie Warren, his research-based practice creates settings, actions, and utopian speculations towards enhancing our collective, effective relationship with architecture. Projects commissioned by Tate, Modern Musik, Casco, Showroom, Spike Island, and Institute Français. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Torsten Schröder is an architect, researcher, and assistant professor of sustainability in architectural design at the Eindhoven University of Technology. He co-founded the Radical Architecture Practice for Sustainability, of course, RAPS network, and with a focus on translating sustainability and circularity into building design practice. Torsten has participated in and led diverse research projects in the last 15 years. Okay, so let's see.
Thank you very much.
No problem at all. And I believe now I'm going to give the mic, I'm going to pass the mic over to Ana.
Thank you. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction backdrop to our collaboration and today's roundtable. We started collaborating a couple of years ago within research networks, and in the past 2 years, we've been looking at how to develop different forms of actually sustainable practices, both trying to apply for funding, but also within the networks that we are part of, the Architecture Research, European Research Network, but also I was invited to take part of RAPS, and from then we started having regular meetings, and the roundtable kind of emerged from the possibility of hosting this set of discussions within our program in the Korean Pavilion Future School. We would like to thank you and extend a big thank you to Hai-Won Shin, who is the curator of this year's Korean Pavilion, for the generosity of allowing us to have this program within the Future School program, and also the possibility of having these discussions, which had actually been, the planning towards the roundtables have been equally enjoyable and creative as we hope the discussions today would be. We would do short presentations, each of us, just more like thoughts and provocations, and then open up the floor to some of the questions, but also an open discussion with the audience around this that Cheo will moderate. Just to set the mode, perhaps I could just share very quickly some images that I think could make us all aware of the urgency we are facing today. And of course, my colleagues will extensively also touch upon that. Sorry, I'm just, so the questions today we're exploring is really how we can imagine, think, see, practicing radicality for a sustainable future, ways of seeing, ways of being, ways of dreaming. You already seen the flyer. And I think what is, what is important for us is how we could take on the contemporary challenges we are facing, such as climate change and social crisis, unequal local and global development and migration, struggles for justice, equality, and the race in social change, and not least the aftermath in the pandemic that raises strong demands for spatial practices, architects, designers, and planners to develop new responses and solutions based on a broader interdisciplinary perspective. And this is what we are focusing on today. How can we develop these practices that we coin and try to develop as radical practices, facing the current situation that we are, which is actually not only urgent, but quite dystopic. and that we need to think critically, but also make radical shifts in how we think around our cities, our rural areas, and the way we practice within our design disciplines. Probably you're all aware of this, but I think it's good just to get a quite sort of drastic backdrop to our discussions. However, fear doesn't have to stop us, and I think this Naomi Klein's quote is very useful. Fear is a survival response. Fear makes us run, it makes us sleep, it can make us act superhuman, but we need somewhere to run to. Without that, fear is only paralyzing. So the real trick, the only hope really, is to allow the terror of the unlivable future to be balanced and soothed by the prospect in building something much better than many of us previously dare hope. And with that, I can just only finalize our introduction by saying that this ecological crisis is only one of the results of the global systemic crisis. And in this quote from On Fire, the Burning Case for a Green New Deal, Naomi Klein argues that the only way to save society and the planet is a fundamentally new economic system without the need of constant growth and new profit-making opportunities. Therefore, there is an urgent necessity for this complex set of economic, political, social, environmental forces that influence development, societal development and transformation today. And therefore also an urgent need for holistic, interdisciplinary, and experimental approaches to address these challenges and explore radical new models. With this, I would like to open the floor, and Joe, you take over here, and I believe that Sonja, you are first of our presentations.
Thank you, Anna. I'll make a start. I don't know if Torsten, you'd like to introduce anything, but I'm happy to make a start on something I've been thinking about for a very long time. And before I start, I'd like to thank the Korean Pavilion, Joe, Anna, everyone who's really made this happen and made this possible. I'm going to start to talk about ways of seeing and a new visual lexicon that we could develop. I'll just try and see if I can share my screen easily. Okay, so hopefully that should work. Can you see my screen?
It's in the overview mode still, Sonja.
Okay, I think I've started now, so that should be fine. We still can't see.
Perfect now.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Okay, ways of seeing, a new visual lexicon, radical practice for sustainable architecture. A lot of what I'm going to put on the table today are ideas I've been working on for some time. They're exploratory, they are provocative, I think, and I hope you might agree. And they might open up new ways that we might approach design practice more generally, even beyond architecture. Complexity underlies everything we do. We're fully aware of this. We've been aware for some time that we have to think in multi-dimension, that we have to work multimodally, that we have to consider multiple species. And yet we still seem to be applying this post-industrial linear way of thinking that doesn't acknowledge the complexity we face. And this is most present or visible in a lot of the technologies that are designed to supposedly inform us, provide feedback and change our behaviors for a more equitable, sustainable future. And yet the visual cues and props that we're faced with are ill-prepared to communicate that multidimensionality, to acknowledge the multi-species context we all live within, and to enable a multimodal communication system that we as a species and others need in order to maneuver our way through this complexity. This is an image of home energy management technology. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may have it in your homes. Actually, some of you might use it and might find it quite helpful. And there are moves towards drawing on this type of technology to manage much more than energy, water, health, care, and moving away from a pandemic. We'll see much more of this in our daily lives. It doesn't help us communicate collective needs. It is targeted towards the individual and their individual wants. We have consistently forgotten and worryingly and puzzlingly in architecture practice especially, the need to acknowledge multiple dimension and the need to visually communicate complexity that moves beyond providing information and feedback. Where do we see this though happen well, and how can we learn from other species? So this idea of visual spatial intelligence isn't foreign to us. It's something we've relied on. We use vision and other senses to create a mental map of where objects are in relation to other objects and the environment. And we as architects and designers do this really well and have done so for a long time. Others do too. Chemists who carry out experiments, surgeons who carry out surgery. Visual spatial intelligence underlies everything we do in life. However, we've tended to do it to benefit the individual, and we've tended to do it in a fairly introspective manner. What we can learn from other species, especially social insects, is how to communicate collective needs to individuals and how to draw on multiplicity of information, both spatial, visual, social, in order to communicate complex needs. Why does this matter for architecture, though, you might ask? I'm going to draw on 3 stories, and I would welcome discussion on this, where I noticed the need for this visual lexicon. This is story 1. It's of a project that involves low energy community housing development in the south of England. I was asked as a researcher to find out why residents were struggling with the new technologies and the low energy technologies they found in their homes. And a lot of my time was spent observing. I actually didn't rely on a lot of known research methods that looked at usage of energy, usage of technologies. I was much more interested in what people did on a daily basis and how they use spaces within their homes and outside of their homes to communicate these collective and individual needs around, in this case, use of energy. And what I found that mattered and was really unusual in the context of energy was that outdoor spaces, allotments, balconies, memories of the past use of site had an influence on how the community came together to communicate collective needs in terms of the spatial boundaries, in terms of the design of the allotments, in terms of their accessibility. The spatial design had an influence on the gestural mode. Story, another part of story 1 and 2 has to do with a separate study, though somewhat connected, where we asked architects and engineers to consider how they imagine use of resource in their designs. In this particular instance, it did focus on energy as well, but we were looking at it more widely to also consider water and other resources. What we found really interesting is that the majority of designers refer to use of diagrams and graphs as a way to convey and convince information. And on the other hand, use of earthly, humanistic images to convey a sense of connection with nature, which did not come across in any client meetings, which did not come across in any projects, in any discussion. These were inner thoughts of designers. What seemed to matter to them most was a connection with nature. And yet what they mostly talked about was the need to convey impact in a quantifiable measure. In this instance, what was noticeable was that visual design had a gestural mode. It was really lacking in space. Space didn't come into the discussion, but vision did. Story 3 is really about a future project where we're trying to join the dots and discuss multimodality. Here we're looking at 3 housing communities. This is a project that's starting quite soon, which will be looking at social insects and how they communicate collective needs in order to develop a new visual language, a new communication protocol to help residents in these communities communicate collective needs within individual homes. So we come back to this diagram that this is adapted from the New London Group, which tries to talk about the design elements of different modes of meaning within communication: visual, linguistic, audio, gestural, spatial. What I'm suggesting and proposing that is absolutely necessary for the future of architecture practice is a new mode of communication that is multimodal, that merges some of these, that takes some out and develops a very different approach to consideration of multi-dimension and multi-species in ways that we design for resources and use of resources collectively as well as individually. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to Torsten, I think, who is going to talk about why this matters and what the urgency is that underlies this.
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you also to Shewu for kind of moderating the session here today. Very nice to meet you. Thanks obviously also to Ana for inviting us here, for having this discussion with you, and also thanks to the Korean Pavilion. I will share my slide, a couple of slides. It's going to be exciting now. Can you see the overview page now, or?
No, we can see the full slide.
Can see the full slide, great. So that's always a bit exciting because that different systems works always differently, as we all know by now. Okay, again, my name is Torsten Schröder, and I will speak about practicing radicality for sustainable architecture, and I will kind of crisscross between ways of seeing, ways of being, and ways of dreaming, which are the kind of overarching topics here for us today. I'm working at Eindhoven University of Technology, but I'm a resident in Germany, so I will crisscross a bit between Germany and Netherlands. So sometimes there's the misconception that the climate crisis is predominantly a future risk. There are many countries in the global south that have already been exposed to catastrophic consequences, but the crisis has fully arrived in Europe as European countries experienced the summer. Greece had a kind of major forest fires, Italy had record high temperatures, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany kind of had these kind of extreme floodings. Many people have died and many have lost their homes and neighborhoods. Sorry. Not long ago, there were the federal elections in Germany, and the climate crisis has also been an important topic. But surprisingly, the mainstream media actually focused much more on the personal shortcomings of the candidates and not so much on the contents of the election programs. So when you look at the election program, there are big differences regarding how to tackle the climate catastrophe. But so the question is how to bring forward the coal phase out, how to accelerate the expansion of renewable energies, how to expand local transport, how to increase CO2 prices and make them more socially acceptable, and many more. But what is interesting is that actually none of the campaigns actually was enough to proposed campaigns was enough to actually reach the climate targets of the Paris Agreement. So this is a brown coal power plant in Germany, and we just have to acknowledge that we are increasingly threatening our own conditions of existence. the focus should not be on the destruction of nature, nor on ecological or environmental problems, but we have to understand them as problems of our inner world of society, of self-produced risks, self-produced threats, as Ulrich Beck in Risk Society argued. So in the Paris Agreement, I think 190 heads of state came together, and maybe it's less surprising that they managed to sign a treaty together. But importantly, they realized that the culture of unlimited economic growth has come to an end. They cannot all kind of fulfill their modernization growth plans at the same time. So scientific evidence points towards the urgency of an accelerated societal transformation to tackle the impacts of climate change, destruction of the biosphere, and crippling inequalities. We are in a pivotal decade characterized by the interconnectedness of challenges, irreversibilities, and tipping points. Humanity has to act now, but without a profound change of our socio-technical systems, we will not tackle the challenges ahead. This is the United Nations emissions gap report that clearly shows greenhouse gases are, there's a little bump in the graph, but they are still rising. That was just due to the COVID crisis, but they are still on the rise, and we are clearly not on a track to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will become. So we are in a sort of state of denial. I think we are all aware that the construction sector has a key role to play in our environmental future. I'll go a bit more quickly. And yes, we have to, being less bad is simply not good enough. Little changes here and there simply will not meet the challenges ahead. So we have to go for a system change, a radical transformation. And radical, if you go to the definition of the meaning of radical, relates to consisting of or going to the root or fundament, necessitating, entailing, or favoring fundamental social, economic or political change. So in my work, I focus very much on the notion of translation. For me, sustainability remains an integration challenge, and we are still struggling how to translate concepts into practice in a meaningful and impactful ways. So how to understand actually sustainable architecture? There's a lot of contestation and perspectives very largely regarding what the key issues are, which scales and element to take into account, and through which design strategies or pathway to address them. So, and it's important, there are different expertises, perspectives, involvements, and responsibilities. And there are also many different challenges. So just to name a few, so maybe it's about, obviously it's about CO2 emissions, but it's also about affordability, about well-being and comfort, maybe about responsible material kind of sourcing, about participatory design process, and many, many more. Importantly, sustainability is contested. So we have to shift attention to the difficulties in framing problems, to the controversies and contradictions. There is no sustainable practice that will make everybody happy, and we need to pay careful attention to who will win or lose in the process. So the concept of sustainability cannot be built itself, so need to be transformed. So we need to shift attention to the way sustainability becomes translated in the way moving towards building materialization. So we have to carefully look how are challenges defined, how are design goals being set in the process and agreed upon, how do we compose design strategies, and how do these design strategies lead to materialization and performance. Much of my work recently has focused on circular economy in building practices, which I see as a subfield of sustainability. And yeah, there's actually a shift from operational energy consumption to embodied energy and material use. So you see here the diagrams how embodied energy and operational energy, how the proportions have changed through time. In the Netherlands, there's a huge demand for new buildings. So we need to build 1 million new homes in the next 10 years, but we also have to renovate 7.8 million homes regarding energy efficiency. But at the same time, we have to reduce CO2 emissions, which is quite a dilemma. I think we also have to question the public debates, intervene into public debates. Do we really need to build 1 million new homes when there are a lot of spaces in the Netherlands that are actually vacant? But I will come back to this. There are a lot of interesting work is already happening with bio-based materials. And very often the 10R ladder, this kind of avoidance strategy, refuse, reduce, renew, reuse, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, recycle, recover, is a way to define and measure the circular economy in building practices. But many or some of these strategies actually get relatively little attention. So for example, refuse is something that seems to be largely overlooked, or reduce as well, or remanufacturing. So I briefly introduce maybe two projects here that try to address these two aspects. So on the one hand, not building. So there are many empty buildings, many offices, especially through the COVID phase. There are many kind of empty retail spaces in the Netherlands. So why don't we find more kind of smart ways of actually using them for short-term or long-term users? So we could develop some clever applications that actually make sure we can use these resources efficiently. Connecting unusual suspects is a collaboration with the TU Delft and some architecture practices and a demolition company. Which actually, so the design cycle, typically with handover of a building, this is the different design stages. Typically, the architect leaves the scene with a handover, but there's also the material cycle where buildings are maintained, are refurbished, dismantled and reused, but they are quite disconnected. So we are trying to bring designers and demolition companies together by actually developing a kind of interaction tool that is actually working both directions. So dismantling companies know when, how to dismantle a building, because if there's a clear design already, then they know how to take it apart in which kind of pieces, so they can be easily reused, but it's also more easy for designers to know what materials become available. Envisioning futures. Yeah, the transition to circular futures seems difficult to persuade people by policies of fact. And this context, storytelling and imagination are a crucial tool. Scenarios can inspire, envision alternative futures, make them tangible and discussable, help aligning diverse stakeholders around a shared vision, and contribute to tackle key challenges ahead. So there seems to be some agreement that the circular future will be mostly modular, bio-based and climate positive. But I think we also have to question whether there should be not more kind of systemic change, a more radical change. And for this, I really like this project by Realities United, who actually question the tyranny of the enclosed air-conditioned spaces, and actually instead suggested that we should maybe focus on clothing and our comfort level to challenge them. And I think that is an interesting, at least, play of thought. Also interesting is the environmentalist Julia Watson, who suggests indigenous kind of technologies that could change the way we design cities. So she built this, she realized this water aquaculture, which cleans half of Calcutta's sewage. Or another example is from Hong Kong, like how actually urban living on minimal space can be. And the Netherlands, they have one of the highest per capita ratios of apartment size to people. So one question is, how can we what can we learn from cultures far away to actually also reduce our own space consumption? So the big question that lingers in the room is still like how to initiate paths towards radical change. And I think it's important to emphasize the urgency, to see the architect as an activist as well, that architects can play an important role in agenda setting and introducing the controversies and multiple stakeholders that are involved. But I think we also have to prepare for drastic changes in our lifestyle and behavior. Slow down, much more lower mobility, sharing instead of owning, and yeah, little changes here and there simply will not meet the challenge ahead. Okay, with this I end, and apologies, I went a bit over time. Sorry for that. Thank you very much. Let's stop that. And stop sharing this. Did I stop sharing it or not?
Oh.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Torsten. Regarding time, by the way, for the other speakers as well, considering the nature of today's roundtable and its significance, I will, as the moderator, if you allow me to, I'll try to give our speakers as much time as they need. And of course, as an, we can maybe take some time out from the discussion session, but I think it's really important for us to get a full understanding of what exactly you're trying to argue, so that we have a better foundation, a better cornerstone for the group discussion session. If everyone's okay with that, we will go that way. Thumbs up? Excellent, brilliant. And once again, thank you so much, Torsten, for a very, very, very inspiring presentation. Okay, next up, I believe, is, let's see.
Jonathan.
Jonathan, yes, on being, I believe.
Hi there.
Jonathan,
yes.
Are you ready?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks for moderating. And yeah, really good to meet you.
Likewise.
Also, thanks to the Korean Pavilion and Anna as the curator of this program for the Atlas of Global and Local Imaginaries. So I got a short provocation that spans ways of being, ways of seeing, ways of dreaming. We are architecture. We're entwined with our buildings, and we mutually affect one another. We're mutually dependent, and you could say we're entangled with our enclosures. Our emotions, our memory, our health, our functioning, our interactions are all informed by the buildings that surround us. And we create and recreate those architectural spaces on a daily basis through our inhabitation, our perceptions, and our actions. But we're not just architecture. We are entangled with environments, with systems, like phones, mobile phone networks, our internet connection, objects, with bodies, other people, and built elements. And this entanglement is between human and non-human, between materialities and immaterialities. And our state is really reliant on the state of these other entities. And so to sustain architecture is to sustain ourselves. To practice architecture towards sustainability is to practice sustaining ourselves. And that seems an absolutely essential goal. So we think of architecture as an assemblage. When we practice architecture, we create and recreate its internal relational dynamics, all those dynamics that make up the assemblage of architecture. So a design decision can affect the emotion of an occupier, a future occupier of a building. It can affect the microecology of plants within a gutter. It can affect, in a much bigger scale, the sense of ownership of a building by the city's citizens. And it affects the movement of material resources around the globe just through how you specify within architecture. And so this assemblage is plural and interconnected, and its effects ripple through ecologies at different scales, and this is totally inescapable. I guess this conception of architecture, though, is quite speculative, and it could be considered as radical. It creates new ways of being. It implies new ways of seeing and of dreaming. It resonates with Timothy Morton's understanding of ecological thought as, and I quote, the thinking of interconnectedness. In this conception, architecture clearly matters and has significant impacts, but how can we hope to understand these relational dynamics and their effects? How can architecture become less about producing buildings and actually become more about producing interrelations in which buildings are a part? So I've been collaborating with conceptual artist Sophie Warren, and more recently with Sophie and psychosocial academic Lita Krisani-Wieland and a psychodynamic therapist, Nigel Williams. And what we're doing is we're developing new ways of considering and engaging with architecture and reigniting the field of architectural psychology. What we're doing is we're blending psychosocial, psychoanalytic, organizational psychology, conceptual art, and experimental architectural methods. We start from a Deleuzian concept of architecture as an assemblage, and through affect theory, as put forward by academics such as Lisa Blackman, and Frederick Jameson's thinking on the political unconscious, and Slavoj Žižek's pursuit of the political and social unconscious of architecture. Through this, we're exploring buildings as psychological subjects, with conscious, and they will have conscious and unconscious qualities. And we're studying how those qualities affect the conscious and unconscious minds of those who use them. So as an example, Slavoj Žižek, he makes this claim that if in Hitchcock's Psycho film, the famous movie, if Norman Bates had not been moving between such disparate buildings as the modernist hotel and the Gothic house, his psychology would not have been sufficiently schizophrenic to be able to murder Marion Crane. So there's a direct sort of link of the psychology of around the architecture, the psychology of the people. So with Sophie, Lita and Nigel, we have made a toolkit that includes 9 tools to uncover the psychology of the architecture. And many use free associative thinking, which has proved to be really incisive in interrogating the architecture. And so far we've examined 2 case study buildings, Tate Modern in London and the French Communist Party headquarters in Paris. We're particularly interested, through using these tools, in the psychology around notions of collectivity, publicness, and political dynamics as embodied within the architecture. And so we're planning on examining other political, public and museum buildings. So just to give you an outline of what we identified within these 2 case study buildings. So for Tate Modern, designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott and Herzog and de Meuron, we worked with a participant group across the organisational teams and strata of the organisation, from maintenance staff, front of house, curatorial staff, people who clean the building, with a group from representing those sort of different teams. They developed responses to the question we posed, which is, what is the building calling for? And then with the group, we realised 2 actions. One, which was a collective address to the building, using the responses to the question, what is the building calling for? And then relaying these through the circulatory spaces of the museum, using the People's Mic from the Occupy movement. The second, titled Solidarity Lines, second collective action, bound the group as a composite, moving architectural element that in silence navigated with collective intelligence, responding to the dynamics of the space. For the French Communist Party headquarters, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, we used other tools from the toolkit. Having spent 3 months in the headquarters interviewing inhabitants and carrying out substantial archive research, we developed a detailed psychological profiling of the architecture. The findings from this research was then triangulated via an innovative psychosocial method known as a visual matrix, whereby images of the building were presented to a group of people with experience of free association and psychosocial methods but without prior knowledge of the building they would be presented with. We then tested the possibility that a stand-in for the building could be part of a series of psychotherapeutic sessions to further unearth unconscious aspects of the building's subjectivity. And this method embodied the title of the research in that it put architecture on the couch. So what arose from these investigations with the French Communist Party headquarters was psychological issues and blind spots, or unknown knowns, if you like to think of them like that. And these included a strong cult of personality within the architectural assemblage over many years, a migrant and hybrid identity, and more recently a split in identity between the building as the party headquarters, and it's called Les Maisons by the comrades, and the same building marketed as Espace Neymar, constituting spaces for hire for fashion shoots, music videos, corporate entertaining, and sort of other cultural media events. And within this, I won't go into detail about the findings, but our understanding of the building as a psychological subject has suggested then a variety of measures to improve the internal relational dynamics of the building with its systems, with its diverse communities of users and non-human entities. And these measures afford a more sustainable future for the building and the assemblage of which the building is a part, using minimum means. So with a deeper understanding of how psychology of occupants, systems, objects and buildings meet, there's an ability to effect real change just through changes in use, in changes in behaviour, in perceptions, in spatial design, without the need of demolition, erasure, consumption of built environment and new building. Of course, we've done experiments on public buildings, but the notion that the psychological investigation of architecture can be rolled out through different typologies. And this approach runs really counter to the notion of buildings being units of investment. I'm thinking back to when Torsten's talking about all these empty units, and then there's a need for building 1 million new homes. And so it activates a sort of psychological characteristics for buildings that in some ways brings them into a closer relationship with citizens and addresses issues around space and well-being, sort of the actual occupants of the building. Our participatory methods also empower people in relation to understanding and potentially acting and altering their architectural environments. And so this dismantles some of the professional ownership that architects have and control over this sort of understanding, this sort of ability to alter environments. But architects, I think, should seek to build less and instead act as facilitators and in some ways stewards of built environment, particularly stewards of the existing built environment. Prioritizing not building seems a completely essential strategy at this point in time. We need to create new terms of engagement with architecture that takes action in response to the climate catastrophe. We have to embrace radicality as an approach that has the potential of producing new ways of seeing, new ways of being, new ways of doing. And these are vitally needed to make a step change so that architects, artists and other cultural thinkers lead in establishing more symbiotic relations with the greater assemblage of what we're a part. And just thinking back to the psychological angle, to end, I'd just like to quote the psychologist Christopher Bolas, who writes about architecture. He says, "We take vivid structures into our dreams, and the unconscious that operates in the material realm of the built, and the unconscious that organizes each self meet." Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan, for extremely profound argument. Okay, and let's see. Yes, of course. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Ana on the topic of dreaming. Ana, ready when you are.
Thank you very much. Let me open the presentation. And so Alternative futures. We have described the global crisis, all of us, and how it affects local and social ecological conditions on several levels. The responses and reactions by local initiatives to this crisis contribute to a larger movement that suggests tactics and ways to create change to common global issues. So in my work and together in my practice with Karl-Johan Westerlund, we have explored the different sites, places, conditions, how we can imagine alternative futures and develop spatial practices for socio-ecological urban and rural development beyond the idea of endless growth. So rethinking, sorry, how that's it changing, sorry, okay, it's there. So rethinking urban and rural growth, in the report of and the reporting book, Prosperity Without Growth, the transition to a low carbon economy and the foundations for the economy of tomorrow, Tim Jackson calls for a redefinition of prosperity in terms of what really contributes to people's well-being. Prosperity consists in our ability to flourish as human beings within the ecological limits of a finite planet. The challenge for our society is to create conditions under which this is possible, is the most urgent task of our times. Jackson argues that the economical crisis is a unique opportunity to invest in change and to leave behind the short-term thinking and belief in endless urban growth. And as we have seen in some of the natural disasters in the recent years, we see that also the way of building cities, the way of expanding urban growth, has also led to an unbalance, creating more floodings and unstable climatic conditions in coastal edges. Here in the city of New York, where also it's interesting to see that some of the responses to this crisis have been community-led and from grassroots movements. So thus sustainability becomes a way of sustaining a contemporary way of living, and sustainable strategies a way of optimizing energy use and consumption to be able to continue to live in the same way as we do, according to the model of the endless urban growth that we are having today in contemporary society. So using this existing model for urban growth, densification is often proposed as the formula for sustainable urban development, a position that does not address issues such as finite resources, social exclusion, segregation, and flexibility. Alternative ways of rethinking the approach to urban growth and the issues of land use, consumption of resources, and the relationship between the city and nature are thus desperately needed. The prevailing models of urban regeneration transform urban areas by a process of gentrification, privatization, dislocation of local communities, increasing segregation and uneven urban and social development. Thus, there is an urgency to address and expand this debate on urban development to also include social and cultural representation. And we also see in the responses and reactions that they are quite strong social movement reclaiming and claiming the space of democratic representation. So in order to analyze and question the current theories and conceptions of urban development, in which densification and economic growth are proclaimed as the way forward for a sustainable future, an examination of other models is needed. Tim Jackson frames the core of the debate. The growth imperative has shaped the architecture of modern economy. This model is always unstable ecologically. It has now proven itself unstable economically. The age of irresponsibility is not about casual oversight or individual greed. If there is an irresponsibility, it was systematic, sanctioned widely, and with one clear aim in mind: the continuation and protection of urban economic growth. And we also see it reflected in the urban growth in the planet. And these are projections of how a large percentage of the Earth population will be living in urban areas. New fields of knowledge, transdisciplinary practices, and radical rethinking of the way we understand urban life, the way we build, beyond the current modes of business as usual, are as crucial to develop strategy and tactics for socially and ecologically sustainable urban growth. In the book, Green Utopianism, Karen Bradley and Johan Hedren introduce an overview of models and examples for emerging alternative practices found in contemporary social environmental movement, looking at concepts such as degrowth, transition, the common, relocalization, and environmental justice. They map models that resonate in historical movements and critique from earlier decades: green waves, ecofeminism, deep ecology, globalization from below, ecological economics, political ecology, social ecology, bioregionalism, and eco-socialism. Learning from these practices and translating them into urban planning strategies, we believe requires explorations into more open-ended planning models, bottom-up initiatives and tactics, taking into consideration the instability and the continuous change of global and local conditions. Bradley and Hedren continue, however, there is not only a need to dream of other futures, but in the context of recent economic crisis, there is also an outright basic need to immediately practice alternatives, to stimulate the utopian impulse telling us that change is both possible and necessary. For new societal arrangements to materialize, new conceptions are needed, dreams, imaginaries, and experiments that are articulated and make the impossible seem possible. And this is the way we build and still build, and without currently in Sweden, this is an image from Gothenburg, and we still don't take consideration to the way we build. So this is a very real scenario that, and in order to imagine these alternative futures and global and local imaginaries, I think it's important to trace what Mark Fisher elaborates in his book, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? Or how strong current narrative, worldview, and idea of reality created and continuously reproduced by capitalism is. Departing from the phrase that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, and a series of scenarios from contemporary films, he describes how the idea of capitalism as being the only realistic political economic system that has infiltrated our minds, to the point where capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizon of the thinkable. Capitalism consumes cultural history, absorbs subversive material, even to the extent of pre-corporation, the preemptive formatting and shaping of desires, aspirations, and hope. He described how it is realistic, and thus what is considered possible at a certain time is always defined by a series of political determinations. Central in this contemporary debate of urban political ecology and environmental aesthetics is a questioning of the hegemonic notion of nature and the relationship between nature and culture. So in Mark Fisher's statement, a proof of the hopelessness of the situation is for us a strong argument of how urgently alternative common imaginaries of possible futures are needed. So to be able to confront the world order and imagine radical socio-ecological change, an ecological view beyond the conventional understanding of sustainability is needed. In the article Radical Urban Political Ecology, Ecological Imaginaries, Planetary Urbanization and Politicizing Nature, Maria Kaika and Eri Swing ask for a radical shift in how we understand the current situation and how we imagine a different future. There is an urgent task ahead to delve into the complex linkages between discourse, post-political management, and environmental socio-ecological inequalities. It is necessary to ask questions about what visions of nature and what social environmental relationships are being promoted, what quilting points are being used and how they are being stitched together, and who are promoting these visions and why, what issues and what voices are being silent in the process, and how this discourse is competing with, altering, and being altered by other alternative discourses. And John Thompson uses the term social imaginary as the creative and symbolic dimension of the social world, the dimension through which human beings create their ways of living together and the ways of representing their collective life. Central in our search and our research is how we can imagine the spatial practices for alternative futures and the relationship between local and global socio-ecological phenomena and conditions. And our point of departure has been to understand global phenomena and forces affect and resonate in local conditions, and how local conditions inform and make impact on global phenomena. And I think this is an image of all the protest Fridays for Future around the globe. And I think it speaks for also the strength of the social movements on a local level that has become a global voice. So the term global and local imaginaries could be understood as characterized by both local and global, has also informed a post-colonial debate in which the aim has been to join attempts to move beyond the limits and exclusions of nationalism, reify notions of the local, and facile celebrations of globalization, testing as it does so the continued potential and limitations of a post-colonial rubric. Following these ideas, we propose to explore, propose, project, present, and express the possibilities of joining local projected visions and ambitions with overarching global themes and global struggles. I will not have time here to go into depth into different examples that we've been working on, but it's trying to explore beyond conventional ways of working in architecture and planning, investigating strategies and tactics that respond and strengthen specific local conditions through reappropriation of existing structures and systems, finding solutions that are less vulnerable, less dependent on resources demanding high-tech solutions and advanced infrastructure. I think I am probably running out of time, so I would wrap up finally that rethinking and challenging the notion of urban growth as a model for economic growth, we hope to invite for a further debate on approaches and imaginations of the future from a manifold of perspectives. The appropriate approaches can obviously not be defined by a singular formula, but would depend on multiple ways of reading potentials and challenges, reconfiguring and assembling them to answer both global and local conditions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Excellent, excellent work. As for the examples, you didn't have enough time to share them with us, but I hope we will get some questions related to your more specific practices in the next round, which is, of course, the altogether discussion round. Yeah, so I will now open the floor. I actually have a few questions myself, but I would want to do this. I really want to do this more in a democratic fashion because I think it's very important for us to have a listen to what our audience thinks about the four presentations, and B, it's only in that kind of a dialectical fashion will we actually we will be able to realize our own talk, if you know what I mean. So let's do that right now. For our wonderful audience, if you have any questions for anyone, feel free to ask. And by the way, since we're not getting any questions now directly, you can either ask through your microphones, your respective microphones, or in the chat box as well.
I have a question if I can, but I can wait also.
Please do not wait. Go ahead. Okay. I believe this is Fidel Meraz.
Yes, it is. That's me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I really enjoy the presentations, and I find some of the suggestions inviting to radical action and radical reactions. I want, and this is an open question for anyone. I wonder if we have also considered the radical, not only the radical action, but also the radical expectation that there is no solution, that is actually no way, that the tipping point was, decades ago, that the capitalist system has pushed us to a position where we are only realizing, and what we need to plan ahead is just a best way to keep living and living a more fair end rather than a continuation. That's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very, very important question. Whenever it comes to these kind of issues, I think for many of us in the field of architecture, that one word that pops up in our mind is feasibility. And especially for this kind of a radical approach towards architecture, and as a matter of fact, the entire world and our future, if it will ever come, as just mentioned so eloquently. I think regarding the nature of this question, we should first give the mic to Torsten, as he focused on radicality. And then if there's anyone else amongst the panelists to share their thoughts on this question, let's do it that way. But first, Torsten, the mic is yours.
Sonja raised her hand as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks, Shihu. Thanks also, Fidel, for your question. Yeah, I think it's an important question to raise. But I think there are actually societies that actually demonstrate that it is possible to live within our kind of environmental boundaries. But I think it's not the rich countries, because they have a incredibly big kind of environmental burden. But for example, if you look, for example, at Costa Rica as a company, as a country, I think the people there manage to live within their environmental boundary. And there are also many of the so-called the developing countries that actually manage to live within their environmental boundaries. The question is whether the rich countries actually can do the same, but it requires this kind of radical change. And I think many people, we are partially not prepared for this. And then the question comes up, like, what kind of political system do we need to enforce these changes? Because we have seen with COVID that we are capable of radical change. Changes happened that nobody anticipated 3 years ago, but only because we were kind of faced with immediate death. And I think one of the key problems of the climate catastrophe is this kind of delayed death, let's say it like this. So, because you all know that these CO2 emissions, they linger in the atmosphere for 100 years. So they also, the impact is partially, also it's here already, but it's delayed. So I think this comes down to the question, like, can we do that with democratic systems, or in how far do we have to become more kind of authoritarian? Maybe somebody else from our panel wants to. Sonja has a hand up.
Thank you, Torsten. I think in terms of the question, is it too late, or can we do it, or is it possible? I would agree with Torsten, but I would also say it is really down to us, as in collectively, architects and designers, to participate much more forcefully in political debates, in setting regulations, in policies, in education, to really make a difference. We have, I think, historically to date been on the sidelines for too long, and are vocal about disagreeing with change, but we're not actually actively participating in enforcing change. So I would say it is possible, as long as we participate actively in politics, in education, in setting social policies, and we absolutely do have the skill to do that. It isn't obvious. The narratives that are dominant are very strong, and I think it has to happen much more. It is happening in some countries, I agree, and it is starting to happen in the developed world in a much smaller measure. But a lot of what we talked about today is about modes of translation, modes of communication, modes of assessment, seeing buildings as psychological subjects, is about, changing the way we communicate to wider circles as well. That isn't happening enough. And I think if it starts to happen much more, then Fidel, it is possible and it's not too late. I'll pass it on to, I think others who've raised their hand.
Yes, I believe Torsten has raised his hand. Let's give the mic back to him. Great.
I don't know, Anna, Jonathan, do you want to respond first, or I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. So obviously, I also believe that we can still do things and that we don't have to put our head into the sand. But I think what is important is that we also, and I think there the imaginaries are actually key, that we actually design futures that are also attractive, but that actually integrate a radical change. So I think there's always the discussion about we have to stop this, we have to stop this. I think we also have to ask what can we gain by a kind of changed system, by less growth. I just wanted to add that quickly. Thank you.
Excellent.
I think it's a very good question, and what it raises is almost it echoes what Anna said about we need somewhere to run to, in a way. Because I think in some ways, Jameson talks a lot about this sort of totalizing effect of late capitalism. So the inability of a society to see outside the ideological limits that it's created. And I think, but Jameson also talks about the strength of cultural projection to develop, and it's almost he does talk about a utopian impulse within it. And that cultural projection tends to want to model alternatives to the way things are. It's almost as a point of difference in order to sort of develop a way of engaging with the problem at hand. And so I think, even though I think in some ways it feels like an almost impossible task, I think it's about the act of imagining difference that will start to develop a notion of there could be a future in a way, or many different futures. But I think it is that imagining and sort of being visionary, as well as putting that into action. And then as architects, that's what we do. We are meant to create visions, and so we have quite a responsibility in this to act in this way, probably more than many other professions. And so it's really the banner, the sort of the relay baton is to us now, and I think that's what we've got to deal with to start to understand how we can go on and how we can think of difference and alternative future.
Brilliant.
Just very brief, I think recap some of the comments that we have said, and I hope that rather to give space to the audience, but just I think I started with Naomi Klein, and I think she argues that the only way really to save society and the planet is to fundamentally have a new economic system without need for constant growth and profit-making opportunities. And Torsten, you were touching on systemic change, and Jonathan, you were also talking about the constraints of the ideological construct that we are living in society. And I was trying to touch upon how capitalism creates the boundaries and the narratives. And I think, Sonja, you were touching upon that too. And I think for me, it's very important to say there are already alternatives. Utopia is not somewhere else. Utopias are here now. And I think movements such as Fridays for Future is one example, but there are many examples of local initiatives. And in the examples I was not able to show now, but in the north of Sweden, there are a lot of local communities creating productive eco-productions, community-led initiatives. And I think also in Spain, in Greece, in many places, there are initiatives with grassroots movements. And the important here is really to say in a way that this is to do with politics, and a systemic climate crisis and climate change is directly related with a systemic change. And I think we need to acknowledge that that is one of the major questions. And I think I just end up with the Extinction Rebellion's quote that the pandemic has shown that the state of exemption of the pandemic has shown that change is possible. So I think radical change is possible. It's just important to address it on different levels. And for us as designers to really show the possibility, whether it's in the ways of seeing, visualizing, in the ways of how we represent, how we create these narratives, how we describe them, how we present them, the way we live in the everyday life, ways of being, how we alternative lifestyles we present, in the ways of dreaming, the ways of imagining towards the future. Because I think for a lot of people, that is what is needed. How do we do it? I think the consciousness is there.
Excellent. If I may add my very humble 2 cents, I would say that as a matter of fact, in Torsten's presentation, amongst the many concepts which he introduced to us, which really caught my attention, one, I think in the context of feasibility of actually realizing this alternative and much more ideal future would be the idea of refuse. And what I mean by that is, mathematically speaking, do we have a solution? We actually already do. We do, and it's to just stop doing whatever we've been doing so far. Now, the problem is, so again, mathematically, technically speaking, it is feasible. The problem is, can we reach some kind of a democratic agreement and therefore realize that into action? So perhaps referring to what Jonathan spoke about on the whole concept of what does it mean to be an architect in this particular state, maybe we shouldn't be focusing too much on how to physically build these, physically realize these imaginaries, but start thinking about how to mobilize people into the directions towards stop doing these destructive actions and start moving towards, again, a more ideal future. So the problem is, if this makes any sense, how do we make more people understand that not doing at this point is actually doing? That's, I think, that will be my immediate response to the question. Okay, do we have any other questions or any further comments?
Kara.
Okay, Kara, thank you so much.
Hello. Yeah.
Hello.
Wait, I'll just move you to my other screen. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the provocations. I really enjoyed everyone's presentations, and also the question that Fidel asked really raised, and you mentioned it, Jay, the practical aspect of approaching these provocations. And I really struggled with the current project, where I am trying to be radical in my approach, and I'm using the ecological footprint of a site to inform how I design a master plan. And personally, I'm struggling with whether or not it's right to actually not do anything when there's the alternative is people not having any homes, let's say, for instance. So it's a very, as all the speakers have shared, it's a really complex problem. And I think for me, I've been in this echo chamber way too long, where I need a new language and how to communicate the need to approach things in a radical way, and to approach things with a different set of rules almost. And so I'm really interested also in like Torsten's work. How do you translate these concepts into something that the developer will understand, or a client who wants the return on investment. And also the question of feasibility is really interesting, because I think in terms of architectural education, we're not really taught how to create these feasible models that a property agent will understand, or will, so it's all about, how do we translate these provocations into something that's directly applicable to the world we currently know, as a stepping stone, so that we can then achieve this more kind of radical vision.
Excellent. Because you mentioned the idea of communication and language, I think it brings me back to, as a matter of fact, Sonja's presentation on verbal lexicon. I think Sonja might have something insightful to share with us regarding your question. I hope I'm right, Sonja.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Cara. I don't have the language yet. I know that we need a new one. So I am currently researching as to what modes that might take and how we create one. So where do we draw inspiration from? And I think one current approach is to learn from other species. And my interest in communication is primarily around how do we communicate a collective need, whatever that might be, to individuals. We used to live in smaller communities, and therefore that was a lot easier, a lot faster. And we're now very dispersed and have little physical connection, and sometimes even digital. We don't sense our environment very well. We don't read things environmentally or spatially or socially very well. So I'm currently looking at other species to understand their communication protocols, where they have evolved a way to read environmental, social, and spatial data for very simple resource needs. Our needs might be much more complex in order to develop that language. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate approach yet. It's one that I'm exploring, and I'm open to ideas as to where else we might draw inspiration from to develop a new language. I mean, I'm very firmly of a belief that we need a new language. How we go about it, I'm exploring one route, but I'm open to many others. So I don't know if that helps, Cara, but I do think a new language would help in your dilemma as to how we go about developing a site, and sometimes not doing anything isn't appropriate. So I think it's a very contextualized response. I'll leave it over to others now. There's lots of hands up.
Excellent. Yeah, I just wanted to make one small clarification on the whole idea of not doing anything, because I was the one who mentioned it. I by no means meant that, it is what it is. Let's just, completely ignore it. Obviously, I'm not saying that. In smaller words, I'm just saying that the things that we've already verified as destructive, just stop doing those as a starting point. But how do we reach a democratic agreement towards stop doing? So let's see, let me try to word this in a logical fashion. The doability of the undoables, if you will. That's what I was talking about. Okay, good. I see that the other panelists have all raised their hands as well. I'm going to first go to Ana.
Right.
Excellent.
Thank you, Cara, for your question and your comments. Well, I think what I'm trying to propose in some of the thoughts that I presented, but I didn't have enough time to display many projects or display any projects. But I think one of the ideas here is that really looking at learning from local initiatives, community initiatives, social movement groups and projects within civil society that both could act locally and globally as a network. So to see this as an expanded idea of ecology or responses to the crisis, to include social relations and human subjectivity. And in this, to imagine and project other ways of coexistence. So here, a territory, a landscape, a city, a neighborhood could be imagined to function as an ecosystem of overlapping productive socio-ecological networks, but also other means of self-governance. So this is a non-physical organizational pattern based more on relationships and connections between actors, people, initiative, programs, activities, and spaces that could be understood spatially and programmatic. And the idea is to really create self-sufficient strategic spaces or a framework to understand these relationships on multiple scales. So I don't know if this answers in any way. It's not perhaps about a language, but it's a proposition of how we can start imagining other ways of organizing ourselves, very much departing from initiatives that exist today, from tactics within social movements, within community initiatives, and within utopian models that exist in different places around the globe that are trying to organize, self-organize themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And let's now go to Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Cara. I think that my simple response would be that I think there's now an ethical duty of architects to look beyond the confines of the site and the confines of the brief. And so I think the area of concern should not be just in a way what your client or your tutor or whoever it is who's setting these parameters. It's actually to break those the boundaries of those parameters, because I think it's in that interconnected or larger context that I think then the solutions can be found. Thanks.
Brilliant. And Torsten.
Oops. Yes, thank you, Cara, for your question. I mean, I think when I spoke about refusing, this was very much in the context of the Netherlands. Yeah, we're knowing that the Netherlands. Sorry, somebody ringing my bell. Yeah, it's a very rich country, and there is one of the highest kind of apartment sizes within Europe, yeah, and compared to other countries. And yeah, there is this kind of yeah, bit crazy debate about these 1 million homes that are now missing. So I think in this context, to raise the question whether you can refuse is a very kind of legitimate and also kind of important. But I'm not really aware in which context you're developing your urban plan, because I think there is a fundamental right also to have a home, to have a roof above your head. And I think what could be maybe worthwhile is to maybe try to kind of map the different stakeholders in that project, and also to think about their different kind of interests. Yeah, so obviously for a home, for occupant, a house is something totally else than for a builder. And I think maybe first of all to set out all these kind of controversies and conflicting goals, just to kind of make them visual and discussable is already one important step. And then I think we need to pay very careful attention how these conflicts are actually being kind of settled. Yeah, this is really, really key. But I think maybe it's first of all, because maybe it's first of all important to put them on the table and to make them discussable, because for sustainability it's also important that we have some sort of public deliberation about goals, because there's no kind of practice that actually is is a win-win-win solution for everybody. There are always people that are entangled, involved, that somehow have to also sacrifice. And it's important to shift attention to who that is and maybe how to deal with that. So there is no easy solution, but I think just by making it explicit what the challenges are and how they conflict, that is already a step forward.
Excellent. Okay, Kara, I hope the wonderful comments of our panelists have given you some idea of how to approach your question. Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? Now, officially speaking, our time is up. However, we will apply some injury time, if you will. So let's not worry too much about the time limit, as long as our panelists have to immediately go somewhere else. But if that is not the case, then yes. If there are any other questions or comments, please feel free to have your say.
I just have a quick question to you, Joe, because it would be nice to end up with a wrapping up of your perspective from South Korea, and more like, we've been having a very Eurocentric panel, and it would be nice to have your kind of Asian, like from another part of the world perspective, which I think, in a way, you're both based in Seoul and Berlin, so you bridge both, but it would be nice to get your perspective and wrapping up of the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for asking me that question. And yes, because I'm based in a very European city versus a very Asian city, I'm double based in that fashion. I think it's really wonderful to have you listen to first these really radical and provocative, inspirational, most importantly, I guess, thoughts of our four distinguished panelists. And I guess from an urbanism and an architecture critic's point of view, I would say that the situation here in East Asia, especially here in Seoul, is really not that much optimistic. And it's because, of course, we've all been very critical of how capitalism plays a role in these particular situations, but it's also the idea of properly and more ideally exercising democracy. And what I mean by that is, and this is very much related to Sonja's presentation, as a matter of fact, because I want to share with you the work of oh my goodness,
Han Sung-pil?
No, not Han Sung-pil. He's a professor of government at Harvard University. I just cannot recall his name. He's the author of a very monumental article titled "Bowling Alone," and I'm just I'm so sorry. I can't believe this is actually happening to me today. Let's see. Oh, Robert Putnam, of course.
It's late in Korea. It's almost night.
No. That can never be an excuse. Plus the fact that we architects, we don't sleep anyways in the first place. So I'm not going to trick anyone regarding that. No, but yes, Robert Putnam at Harvard, back in 1995, he published a rather interesting article by the title of "Bowling Alone," and essentially what this means is he discusses how the bowling culture, the bowling alley culture in the US in the 90s has shifted from conducting the so-called community tournaments, like who's the best in your neighborhood there was that kind of a culture in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then it transformed into a more individualistic culture of, say, for example, only a small group of very close friends, or you're out on a date with your potential partner and you want to just show off to them how well you do at the bowling alley and that kind of thing. And what he discovered throughout studying that shift of phenomenon was that excuse me, was that when you go to the bowling alley as a larger group. It's not just about the game, it's also about the food and drinks you have at the alley, and therefore you have this atmosphere of discussing social issues. So how is this political candidate doing versus that one for the next election, and that kind of a thing. And the bowling alley as an architecture provided that space to let democracy flourish. Whereas now the architecture itself is identical, but its function is completely different because of that shift of culture. Fast forward to 2021, we are now in the second year of the most global pandemic ever in the history of humanity. And I think in these kind of circumstances, it makes especially a very, very overcapitalized city like Seoul, much more difficult for people to connect in a fashion where we can develop not just the system, but also the idea and collective culture, the collective psychology, the collective consciousness of democratic thinking, democratic decision-making, and therefore developing, designing a better architectural future. So I think this is an immense challenge that we face nowadays. And I would say with the technology that we have, not just being Korean, although of course we have companies like Samsung and LG providing the entire world with the hardware that enables the very individualistic culture that we have now. Because it's a global issue, it's not just about Asia, it's also about Europe, it's also about the Americas, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, to have this kind of a conversation within the platform of the Korean Pavilion, I think has that kind of a significance. And therefore, I think regarding Jonathan's work, of how do we rethink with the idea of better understanding the very psychology of the inhabitants of our architectures, rethink the whole idea of architecture in the first place. What is its purpose? What should its telos be? If the originally understood telos was wrong, how do we fix that? And how do we generate a more collective understanding of it? And therefore, for example, what really worries me about the global movement of Fridays for Future, for example, is that while it's a really, really brilliant movement and we should have it in more cities and more countries, what about the rest of the week? Is it influencing the pedagogics of Monday through Thursday so that it inspires these young people that we are completely paying full attention to what you're saying, what you're arguing, and we are going to share that idea throughout generations so that we design a new pedagogics, so that we completely change the system. Is that happening simultaneously? Unfortunately, the way I see it, not so much. So I think these are the kind of challenges that we face, and how do we realize that as architects and activists who are paying the keenest attention to these issues, I think is going to be a really crucial task that we're going to have to tackle for the next years.
That was brilliant. A very nice ending note. I don't know if we have any more comments or anything else, but I think we are about time to finish. Any of my colleagues that want to say, I just take the chance to say thank you to all of you, to the audience for taking part, for the questions, for my colleagues for the excellent and really inspiring presentations, and to you two for being such a brilliant moderator and kind of putting